With the crisis in the Middle East over, it seemed the world had avoided war. But the situation in nearby Greece was still deteriorating. During World War II, the Communist Party and other forces in Greece resisted Nazi Germany. When the war ended, the German troops withdrew. The Communist Party's power grew, and the possibility of a Soviet-like government becoming independent increased. The British were afraid of the situation. If things continue like this, Greece will fall into the Soviet sphere of influence. With this in mind, Britain supported the royalists-led Greek government in order to counter the Greek Communist Party. Thus, a structure was created in which Britain and the Soviet Union were in conflict, with Greece as the stage. General elections were then held in Greece. Royalists used the military and police to interfere in the election. Angered by this, the Communist Party boycotted the election, and some of its members resorted to guerrilla-style armed disarmament. Thus began civil war in Greece. Moreover, these guerrillas were operating with the support of Yugoslavia. From Greece's perspective, this was Yugoslav interference in their internal affairs. This also meant that Yugoslavia was interfering in Greek politics. The Greek government, concerned about this, filed a complaint with the UN Security Council, claiming that there had been border violations in the northern border area. The Greek problem became an international issue, and fierce conflict began. The German issue further intensified this conflict. From the start, it was decided that Germany would be treated as a single economic nation. However, in reality, Germany was in a contradictory state, divided between four countries: the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. So it was only a matter of time before the countries came into conflict. The Allied Control Council was located in Berlin. The structure of this council was such that if even one country opposed it, no decision could be made. So it quickly becomes bogged down. France was particularly vocal in its opposition. Having been occupied by Germany during World War II, France was reluctant to see a strong Germany return. France's occupation of Germany was aimed at weakening Germany as much as possible. Therefore, France opposed the centralization of Germany and argued for a federated state with decentralized power. France also argued that Germany should be weakened economically. France had repeatedly opposed decisions made by the Allied Control Council. The Soviet Union also took a tough stance against Germany. The Soviet Union was not occupied like France. However, the Soviet Union suffered the most damage in the war against Germany. The Soviet Union then occupied Germany with the intention of forcing Germany to pay reparations. Therefore, all factories and machinery in the areas occupied by the Soviet Union were dismantled and transported to the Soviet Union. On the other hand, Stalin also wanted to maintain Soviet influence over all of Germany. That's why he insisted that Germany should remain united. He did not want Germany to be divided. It was Britain that was in direct opposition to the policies of France and the Soviet Union. The eastern part of Germany that the Soviet Union was to occupy was an agricultural region. On the other hand, the northwestern part of Germany that Britain was to occupy was an industrial region. This was to Britain's advantage as it would give them control over the heart of the German economy. But at the same time, it had the disadvantage that they could not get food from Germany. Britain was forced to spend money on occupying Germany even though it was unable to rebuild its own country. The burden is beginning to fall heavily on Britain. Thus, Britain's occupation of Germany was based on the policy of ending the occupation as quickly as possible and encouraging Germany to become independent. As a result, Britain came into conflict with France, which disliked German independence. The United States also took a position closer to that of the UK. The United States believed that the reparations imposed on Germany after World War I were too high and contributed to World War II. The United States therefore occupied Germany with the aim of rebuilding Europe without demanding excessive reparations from Germany. As such, the policies of the countries occupying Germany varied widely. As a result, they were unable to decide on a policy at the Allied Control Council, and the Council was left unable to act. As a result, each occupying force pursued its own occupation policy in its own region. The pretense of a unified Germany no longer exists. It was a bitterly cold winter that arrived in Europe, where relations between the great powers were deteriorating. Roads and canals froze over. The food transport network came to a halt. If the transportation network stops, they won't be able to transport coal. As a result of the factories being shut down, post-war reconstruction slowed down significantly. People desperately trying to survive in the chaos suffered from hunger due to a lack of food. This led to social instability. Meanwhile, demonstrations and strikes were held all over the country. Governments around the world were preoccupied with their own affairs. American government officials stationed in Europe reported to the United States about the dire state of the European economy. The United States became increasingly worried that communism might take advantage of this crisis to expand its influence into Europe. Let's look at Italy and France at this time. Italy had already abolished the monarchy through a national referendum and transitioned to a republic. In France, the Constitution of the Fourth Republic was approved in a national referendum, and the country was moving towards the Fourth Republic. In both of these countries, where the regime transition occurred, the Communist Party was part of the coalition government. In both countries, Communist Party played a central role in the resistance against Nazi Germany during World War II. As a result, the Communist Party gained a high level of support among the people. However, after the end of World War II and the intensification of conflict between East and West, Western powers began to believe that the Communist Party was under the influence of the Soviet Union. And they gradually began to exclude the Communist Party from coalition governments. This was a bad situation for the Soviet Union. At this time, Stalin was hoping to maintain his influence by bringing the Communist Party into the coalition. If the Communist Party is excluded from the coalition, that policy will collapse. Finally, Stalin came to the conclusion that compromises with the West were no longer possible. The conflict between East and West was reaching a critical point. In the midst of this, Britain's economic situation worsened and it was finally unable to bear the burden of the occupation costs and reached its limits. We can no longer continue the occupation. But if we withdraw now, the Soviet Union's power will grow stronger. We want to keep the Soviet influence out of the industrial zone. Thinking this way, Britain proposed to the United States that they unify the occupied territories. If the occupied territories are integrated, the United States will have access to coal from the industrial areas. It was a fascinating story for America too. Thus the American and British occupation zones were united. And finally, Germany began to move towards division. But that's not all. Britain, having reached its limits, decided to cut off its support for Greece and Turkey. Britain had suffered great damage in the war and no longer had the strength to support other countries. As a result, Britain gave up on the idea of a third force, changed its policy, and began to aim to strengthen its ties with the United States. President Truman of the United States wanted to avoid at all costs Greece and Turkey falling into the hands of the Soviet Union. He therefore decided that the United States should take over the aid to Greece and Turkey that Britain had left. He gave speeches to persuade Congress to move towards containing the Soviet Union.
The gravity of the situation which confronts the world today necessitates my appearance before a joint session of the Congress. The foreign policy and the national security of this country are involved. One aspect of the present situation, which I present to you at this time for your consideration and decision, concerns Greece and Turkey. One of the primary objectives of the foreign policy of the United States is the creation of conditions in which we and other nations will be able to work out a way of life free from coercion. This is no more than a frank recognition that totalitarian regimes imposed upon free peoples by direct or indirect aggression undermine the foundations of international peace and hence the security of the United States. Should we fail to aid Greece and Turkey in this fateful hour, the effect will be far-reaching to the West as well as to the East. We must take immediate and resolute action. The seeds of totalitarian regimes are nurtured by misery and war. They spread and grow in the evil soil of poverty and strife. They reach their full growth when the hope of a people for a better life has died. We must keep that hope alive. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedoms. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation. Great responsibilities have been placed upon us by the swift movement of events. I am confident that the Congress will face these responsibilities squarely.
This speech, which would later become known as the Truman Doctrine, led the United States to provide military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey. This marked the beginning of the expansion of American influence into the Mediterranean and Middle East. At this time, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall was visiting Moscow. He spent 6 weeks persuading the Soviets that a revival of the German economy would benefit all countries, including the Soviet Union. However, Stalin argued that a compromise is possible only when both sides are exhausted from negotiations. He remained adamant about wanting Germany to be weakened and for heavy reparations to be paid. Marshall finally returned home with the conclusion that the Soviet Union did not want the quick resolution to the German problem and was deliberately delaying the recovery of the European economy. Marshall then ordered the Soviet expert Kennan to draw up a plan for the recovery of the European economy. This is the Marshall Plan. So how did he plan to revive the European economy? In the first place, pre-war Europe was a place where countries were connected by economic networks. However, World War II destroyed the country, its economy, and everything else. As a result, each country will come to think that the recovery of their own country is the top priority. In Germany in particular, reconstruction was put on the back burner to the point that plans such as let's turn the entire country into agriculture and let's keep the economy as weak as possible were proposed. Seeing this situation, Marshall thought, Europe cannot recover if each country continues to rebuild post-war separately. He wanted to once again connect countries through an economic network. What is important in such a plan is Germany's presence at the heart of Europe. In order to once again connect countries through an economic network, it is essential that Germany is rebuilt. It was from this idea that a plan for the recovery of the European economy was created. It was a plan for the United States to provide massive economic aid to all European countries, including not only Western Europe and Germany, but also Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. When Britain heard about this plan, they immediately jumped on board. Britain led Europe in insisting on accepting American aid. Britain then eagerly persuaded France, which did not want a strong Germany to return and was determined to keep the German economy as weak as possible. Finally, France also began to move in the direction of the Marshall Plan. As I said earlier, the Marshall Plan did not just target Western European countries. It also covered all European countries, including Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Therefore, Eastern European countries also became interested in the Marshall Plan. Czechoslovakia, which was particularly economically devastated, began to strongly demand participation in the Marshall Plan. Stalin strongly opposed this. If Eastern European countries joined the Marshall Plan, American influence would extend to Eastern Europe. Accepting the Marshall Plan meant the collapse of the Soviet Union's security policy of forming a sphere of influence. This was an unacceptable proposition for the Soviet Union. Stalin, believing that the Soviet Union's power was in danger, refused to join the Marshall Plan. And he believed that Eastern Europe needed to be more tightly controlled. He also ordered that Eastern European countries be barred from participating in the Marshall Plan. He will strengthen his control over the powers that be. He organized a conference of Communist Party from 8 European countries and established an organization to control the Communist Party in each country. This is the Cominform. The organization's purpose was to unite communists in the struggle to fight capitalism and resist America. Thus, the Western Bloc, led by the United States, and the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union, were formed. The division of Europe into East and West became definitive, and the Cold War began.